Hello, my name is Todd Miranda, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate how to work with basic animations in WPF using only XAML. Now let's begin by creating a new project in Microsoft Visual Studio, and we'll create a .NET Framework 3.0 project, a Windows application using the Windows application template. We'll name this appropriately, and alright. So let's begin by creating some element that we can animate. So we'll go to our grid and we'll create an ellipse, and we're going to set its width to be, let's say 100, and its height to be, say, 50, about half of that. And for purposes of this video, we're going to set the margin, and we're going to set it initially to 0. And then the last thing we'll do is we'll go in here and we'll give it a fill, and we'll set the fill to blue. Alright, so if we look up in our window, that gives us our ellipse. We'll expand the size of our window a little bit so we've got some more room to work with. Alright, so there's an element that we can use to begin with. If you've looked at animations in WPF, they might seem a little complicated. You might wonder why all the pieces that are there. Why does the storyboard have to be there? Why is there all these other elements? Why can't I simply do a double animation on a particular property of an ellipse? Well, hopefully I'll be able to clear some of that up. So let's begin by opening up our ellipse to be an open tag instead of just a single line closed tag. And we want to be able to respond to an event in XAML to kick off our animation. So we can do that by using the triggers collection of our element. In this case, it's our ellipse. And we'll go down here and we'll choose our ellipse.triggers. Okay, so we know that our triggers takes a particular type of trigger, and although we could use other types of triggers, in this case we're going to do an event trigger, and we're going to specify that our routed event that we will respond to is an ellipse dot mouse left button down. Alright, no space in there. Okay. So now we also know that our event trigger takes a collection of actions. So we know that we've got to have our event trigger.actions tag here. Okay, now here comes in the first place where we have to see why we use some of the additional elements that we see used in XAML animations, or animations that are programmed purely in XAML. An action actually takes a trigger action object, or an object that derives from the trigger action class. So we can't put a double animation or any of the other animation classes, because the animation classes are not really actions themselves. So they can't be added directly to the actions collection. So what we have to do is we have to put the storyboard here, because it is can be considered an action and it can be added to the actions collection. So the first thing that we can do here is our action begin storyboard. So that is an action that we know we can use. So we've got our begin storyboard action. So there's where the begin storyboard comes from, and obviously, like we said, that's where the storyboard comes from, because we want to begin a particular storyboard. So we'll add our storyboard here that we want to begin. Alright, now the storyboard has a few properties that we really want to target on right now. And the first one that's important to us at this point is our target property. So we can do target property, and we'll just set the target here, and we'll say that that target property is going to be our margin. That's why we specified that we had a margin of 0 to begin with. So we'll specify that our target property is margin, and we want to determine what thing we want to be in our storyboard. And we can have more than one animation here, but in this particular case we're going to have one animation. We'll just do a double animation. So let's add our double animation in here. And the reason we're using a double animation is because we want to animate a double value. So we want to animate a numeric value within our margin property, because we're going to set the margin property to various values over time, and the time that we want to set that to is our duration. So we'll specify a duration value here, and the duration value is in hours, minutes, and seconds. So we obviously don't want an animation that's going to take an hour, and we really don't want an animation that's going to take longer than a minute, even a minute, so we'll put 0 there. And let's say that it takes, we'll go ahead and say 10 seconds, which is a very long time for an animation, but for demonstration purposes this will work out really well. Now there's two other properties that are really some of the more important properties that we'll need for this particular demonstration, and then we'll see how we don't need one of them in a minute. But to begin with, we need a beginning value and an ending value for our double value, for the value of the double that's going to be placed in the target property margin. So we'll say from, and we'll specify from goes from 0, and we need a 2. And the 2 goes to, we'll say, 200. Alright, so what we've done now is we've set a double animation. We've set the value for our double to go from 0 to 200, and we've told that we want to go from 0 to 200 over 10 seconds. So what that's going to do is the values between 0 and 200 are going to be interpolated across a 10-second span. So the mathematics here are actually pretty simple. We could go ahead and do the mathematics, and we could determine what value it'll be at 1 second, at 2 seconds, at 3 seconds, since we have nice even numbers. But it's not really necessary, because the WPF is going to take care of that for us and set the interpolated values, but from 0 to 200 across that 10 seconds. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and build this, and you'll notice that when we do our build succeeded. So far so good. And then I'm going to run it. So it runs okay, but the one thing that I want to show you is we're going to get an error when we click on our ellipse, and we're going to see what that error is, and then we're going to address why we got that error. So you see that our error says that double animation cannot be used to animate the property margin because of its incompatible type system.windows.thickness. So the point here is that we have to be careful when we set our target properties for our animations, and then look at the type of animation. We don't have type converters that will take over for us by default in a situation like this. So we don't have a type converter that will convert our 0 to 200 double into a margin value, alright, which is of type thickness. So even though in certain cases type converters work for us in XAML, in cases like this it doesn't. So we need to be sure that we're aware of the type of the target property that we're trying to set. So what we're going to do now is change margin to width, which we know will take a double value, and that'll work. And then we're going to go ahead and run the application again. Now, when we click on our ellipse, you'll see that over a 10 seconds period of time, we go from 0 out to 200, and our animation completes successfully. Alright? So, that's great. Now that we've seen that happen once, we're going to go ahead and set our duration down to something a little bit faster so that we can do more with this. and we'll see that we can add some other properties to our double animation here that will potentially add some additional effects to our animation. In this case, we're going to add the auto reverse. So we're going to set auto reverse to true. By default, it is false. What this will do is take our ellipse, and it'll start it at 0. It'll go to 200 over 5 seconds. It'll auto reverse and then go back to 0. So let's run this and see what happens. So here we are expanding out to 200. We should auto reverse and then begin to go back down to 0. So therein lies the problem. When we did the auto reverse, we went back from 200 to 0. Even though the original width of our ellipse was 100, as soon as the animation starts, the value of the width is set to the beginning value of our animation, which is 0. So we jump from 100 to 0, animate up to 200, and then we auto reverse and go back down to 0. We don't go back to what we originally started at. So how do we solve a problem like that? Well, from is not necessarily required. So let's cut from out of our double animation statement, and we'll run this again, and we'll see if this is not quite so confusing of an animation, because when we click on our ellipse, we're not going to get that initial jump back to 0. So I'm going to click on my ellipse and we'll see what happens. Alright, so did you see when I clicked on my ellipse, we started at its value that was 100, we animated out to 200, we did the auto reverse, and we returned back to our original value. So you can see that the setting from sometimes can be helpful. Other times it may give you some unexpected results. There's another way we can accommodate this exact same transform. We're setting the target property to be width. Well, if we had made this storyboard and this animation to be a little more generic, to be applied to, say, multiple different types of objects, what if an object that we applied this to didn't really have a width property? Well, the way we can do that is by transforming, making the target property be something that's a little bit more generic. So let's begin inside our ellipse by adding another section to our ellipse, and we're going to call this ellipse.render.transform, and we're going to put a scale transform inside here, and we're just simply going to specify by default that our scale X is equal to 1 and that our scale Y is equal to 1, so that we get a uniform scale and it doesn't scale up or down. So we get our ellipse by default is going to be scaled just 1 to 1, so it'll stay the exact same size. Now let's go to our target property and to our double animation here. First of all, let's change our double animation from, remember we took out the from, but we're going to set the to be 2. So you can see here where we're going. We're going to change the scale X and or the scale Y to from whatever it is to 2. So we're going to double the size of the object. We'll leave auto reverse true and duration set to 5. So let's change our target property. Now, one of the things that I didn't mention earlier that needs to be pointed out is the target property is of type property path. Alright, so what that means is we can specify a fully qualified path to a particular property and send that to our target property. Now, if a target property is a dependency property or an attached property, we can use parentheses to identify that. So in this case, we're going to say open paren, and we're going to say the ellipse.render transform, That's right. Except we need a T here, a capital T. Okay. And then we're going to put a dot, and we're going to open paren, and we're going to do scale transform, and we're going to say scale transform dot, and let's specify scale X. So we were setting the width earlier, so now we're going to change the X scale factor as our target property. Okay, so you see we've got an open paren, ellipse, render, transform, close paren. Then we specify the dot, and again open paren, scale transform dot scale X. So again, the reason why we would use our parens here is technically we could make this instead of ellipse a more generic like framework element or UI element, and that's why you would need the parentheses here to fully qualify that. And then the scale transform we got to put in parentheses because there's not a scale transform property directly off of the ellipse. So if we didn't put the parens, it would be looking for that directly off the ellipse object. So anytime we have an attached property or when we need to fully qualify that property, we can use these parens. So previously if you remember, we were setting the target property to width, setting it to change from 100 to 200. Now we're going to affect the scale X from 1 to 2, which will effectively accomplish a similar goal. So let's play this. And we'll click on our ellipse. And you see that we get our expansion here. We're changing the scale factor of in our X direction, and we auto reverse back to where we started. So very similar effect, but a little bit more generic, because technically this storyboard could be applied, if we change this to a more generic term, could be applied to multiple things besides just an ellipse. So that's why we would do that particular type of change to our double animation. So let's say we wanted to do something more complex, like maybe we want to change not only the scale X but also the scale Y. Well, remember that this begin storyboard, which is our action, is inside a actions collection. So I'm going to copy that storyboard. I'm going to add another begin storyboard within our actions, and this time we'll change this to scale Y, and maybe we'll change that to 3 so that we change the scale of that, and we're going to change the duration even, so we can have different durations here. And let's run this so that we can see how that reacts. So you see that we get both our scale in the X and Y direction, and notice how we get that that odd kind of look, almost like it's crawling to the right, and that's because we changed the duration of our Y expansion, of our Y scale, to a smaller number of seconds, so it happens faster. So we can create effects like that, if you want to see that again, that make it look like it's actually almost kind of crawling to the right and then going back to its original position. So for the most part, even though animations can be very complex, there's a lot more to animations than just this. This gives you a good start in working with animations in XAML. You see how easy it can be to set these animations as long as you can get your target property fully qualified path right and the correct type of animation, because we could do color animations as well. We can do different types of animations. You can see that beginning to work with those animations can actually be fun and easy to do and enable you to do some really neat effects pretty simply.